cruel millionaire forced a waitress to play the violin, but her talent surprised everyone. The final note hung in the air, a crystalline whisper that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Abigail lowered her violin, her eyes still closed, lost in the echo of her own creation. For a moment, the grand concert hall was utterly silent, as if the audience had collectively forgotten how to breathe. Then, like a dam breaking, the applause erupted. It started as a trickle, a single pair of hands clapping in the front row, before swelling into a thunderous ovation that shook the very foundations of the building. Abigail opened her eyes, blinking against the harsh stage lights, her chest heaving with exertion and emotion. As she scanned the sea of faces before her, most of them a blur of movement and color, a gaze locked onto a single figure, standing motionless at the back of the hall. Even from this distance, she could feel the intensity of his stare. Garrett Whitman, the man who had once sought to humiliate her, now stood transfixed. His expression a complex tapestry of awe, pride, and something deeper, a pain so raw it made Abigail's heart clench. In that moment, as the applause continued to wash over her, Abigail felt the weight of their shared history, of the secrets and lies that had brought them to this point. The melody she had just played, the one that had captivated this prestigious audience, was more than just a piece of music. It was a bridge spanning generations, a key unlocking a past neither of them fully understood. As Abigail took her bow, her eyes never leaving Garrett's, she knew that this performance was both an end and a beginning. The truth that lay between them, as delicate and powerful as the notes she had just played, would change everything. And as the curtain began to fall, Abigail couldn't help but wonder, in the grand symphony of life, was this the finale or merely the opening movement? Savannah, Georgia, a city where old-world charm collided with modern ambition, served as the backdrop for a tale of two worlds. In one side stood the grand mansions and manicured lawns of the elite, their lives a carefully orchestrated symphony of wealth and wealth. On the other, the humble neighborhoods where dreams often fell victim to the harsh realities of making ends meet. It was in one such modest neighborhood that Abigail Taylor first drew breath. Born to a seamstress mother and a carpenter father, Abigail's earliest memories were steeped in the scent of sawdust and the rhythmic hum of a sewing machine. Their small home, while lacking in material luxuries, overflowed with love and the quiet determination to make something of themselves. From the moment Abigail could walk, it was clear that music flowed through her veins. She would tap out rhythms on tabletops, hum melodies that seemed to come from nowhere, and beg to listen to the old records her grandfather kept in a worn cardboard box. It was her grandfather, a former musician in a small-town orchestra, who first placed a violin in her tiny hands. "This violin is more than just wood and strings, Abigail," he had said, his eyes twinkling with a mixture of pride and nostalgia. "It's a bridge to your dreams. Keep playing and one day it'll take you there." Those words became Abigail's mantra, a beacon of hope in a world that often seemed determined to extinguish such fanciful notions. As she grew, so did her talent, nurtured by endless hours of practice in the small room her parents had set aside for her. While other children played outside or watched television, Abigail lost herself in the world of music, her fingers dancing across the strings with increasing grace and precision. But talent, no matter how extraordinary, couldn't change the harsh realities of their financial situation. Private lessons, better instruments, music schools, these remained tantalizingly out of reach. Instead, Abigail pieced together a musical education from library books, online tutorials, and the occasional free workshop at the local community center. Her parents, seeing the fire that burned within their daughter, worked extra shifts and pinched pennies to buy her sheet music and replacement strings. As Abigail entered her teenage years, the contrast between her two worlds became increasingly stark. By day, she attended the local public high school, where her passion for classical music made her an oddity among peers more interested in pop and hip-hop. By night, she waited tables at the Magnolia Room, one of Savannah's most upscale restaurants, where the city's elite dined on gourmet cuisine and discussed summer homes and stock portfolios as casually as others might talk about the weather. It was here, amidst the clink of fine china and the murmur of moneyed conversations that Abigail first crossed paths with Garrett Whitman. Heir to one of Savannah's oldest and wealthiest families, Garrett was everything Abigail was not: privileged, connected, and seemingly destined for greatness from the moment of his birth. Garrett Whitman's world was one of marble floors and crystal chandeliers of boarding schools and Ivy League universities. From an early age, he had been groomed to take over the family's vast business empire, his life mapped out with the same precision as the architectural plans for their palatial estate. But beneath the polished exterior and razor-sharp business acumen lay a soul in turmoil, haunted by a past he could neither fully remember nor entirely forget. Garrett's earliest memories were not of lullabies or bedtime stories, but of the haunting melodies his mother would play on the grand piano in their living room. Elizabeth Whitman had been a prodigy in her own right, a concert pianist whose career had been cut short by marriage and motherhood. In those quiet moments, when the rest of the house slept, she would pour her unfulfilled dreams into the keys, creating music that seemed to come from another world entirely. But those moments of beauty were fleeting, shattered by the harsh realities of the Whitman household. Garrett's father, Jonathan, was a man who viewed emotions as weaknesses and art as a frivolous distraction. Under his cold gaze, Elizabeth's music gradually faded, replaced by the artificial tinkling of cocktail parties and charity galas. The day Elizabeth died, a car accident on a rainy afternoon, the music in Garrett's life died with her. Jonathan, never one for sentimentality, had the piano removed the very next week. "It's time to focus on what really matters, son," he had said, his hand heavy on Garrett's shoulder. "The future of our family, our legacy. That's what your mother would have wanted." And so Garrett buried his grief and his memories, throwing himself into the cutthroat world of business with a fervor that both pleased and slightly unnerved his father. He excelled in his studies, graduated at the top of his class, and quickly gained a reputation as one of the shrewdest young businessmen in Savannah. By his late 20s, he had doubled the Whitman family fortune and expanded their influence far beyond the city limits. Yet for all his success, Garrett felt a hollowness at his core, an emptiness that no amount of money or power could fill. He moved through life like a perfectly programmed automaton, making all the right moves, saying all the right things, but feeling nothing. The music that had once been the backdrop of his childhood became a distant memory, locked away in a part of his heart he dared not explore. It was in this state of emotional numbness that Garrett first encountered Abigail at the Magnolia Room. She was just another waitress, another faceless member of the staff that catered to his every whim. But there was something in the way she carried herself, a quiet dignity and determination that caught his eye. For a brief moment, as she refilled his water glass, their eyes met, and Garrett felt a flicker of something he couldn't quite name, a recognition, perhaps, of a kindred spirit hidden beneath the trappings of their vastly different lives. Lasse. Little did either of them know that this fleeting encounter was merely the prelude to a symphony that would change both their lives forever. As Abigail continued to chase her dreams, balancing her passion for music with the grueling reality of making ends meet, and Garrett built his empire on the foundations of emotional detachment, fate was quietly setting the stage for a collision of their worlds, a collision that would unearth long-buried secrets, challenge everything they thought they knew, and awaken parts of themselves they had long since forgotten. In the grand tapestry of Savannah's history, Abigail and Garrett were but two threads, one humble, one gilded, about to be woven together in a pattern neither could have foreseen. Their story, like the haunting melody that connected them, was poised to resonate far beyond the confines of the individual lives, touching on universal themes of ambition, identity, and the redemptive power of art. The Whitman estate glittered like a diamond against the velvety night sky, its windows ablaze with light and laughter. Savannah's elite had gathered for one of Garrett's infamous soirees, an event that promised to be the talk of the town for weeks to come. Inside, the air hummed with the quiet confidence of wealth and power, the soft clink of crystal glasses providing a delicate counterpoint to the murmur of conversation. Abigail moved through the crowd like a ghost, her black and white uniform allowing her to blend seamlessly into the background. She balanced a tray of champagne flutes with practiced ease, her eyes downcast to avoid making unwanted eye contact with the guests. This wasn't her first time working an event at the Whitman estate, but the opulence never failed to make her feel small, out of place. As she weaved between clusters of finely dressed patrons, snippets of conversation drifted to her ears. Stock portfolios, summer homes in the Hamptons, private jets. It was a world so far removed from her own that it might as well have been on another planet. Abigail allowed herself a moment of wistful thinking, imagining what it would be like to be on the other side of the tray, to be one of these carefree, laughing guests. Her reverie was abruptly shattered by a familiar voice, one that sent a chill down her spine. "You there, waitress," Garrett Whitman called out, his tone casual but laced with something Abigail couldn't quite place. "Come here for a moment. Be for a moment." And Abigail's heart skipped a beat as she turned to face him. Garrett stood at the center of a small group, his tailored suit accentuating his tall, athletic frame. His eyes, a steely blue that seemed to cut right through her, held a glint of amusement that made Abigail's skin prickle. "Yes, Mr. Whitman?" she asked, keeping her voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in her stomach. Garrett's lips curled into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I couldn't help but overhear earlier. You play the violin, is that right?" Abigail hesitated, unsure of where this was going. "Yes, sir, I do." "How charming," Garrett said, his voice dripping with feigned interest. He turned to his companions, who chuckled obligingly. "Ladies and gentlemen, it seems we have an artist in our midst. Why don't you play something for us?" Abigail, was it? In the way he said her name, as if savoring some private joke, made Abigail's cheeks burn. She glanced around, suddenly aware of the eyes on her, the expectant smiles that held more cruelty than kindness. I'm working, Mr. Whitman," she stammered, desperately searching for a way out of this situation. Garrett waved his hand dismissively. "Nonsense, I'm sure we can spare you for a few minutes. There's a violin right over there with the orchestra. Go on, show us what you can do." It wasn't a request, it was a command. Abigail felt trapped, caught between her need for this job and the humiliation that awaited her. With shaking hands, she set down her tray and made her way to the small stage where the orchestra had been playing earlier. The violin felt foreign in her hands, not like the worn instrument she practiced on at home. As she raised the bow to the strings, Abigail could feel the weight of every gaze in the room. The silence was oppressive, filled with anticipation, not for a performance but for a spectacle. Closing her eyes, Abigail took a deep breath. In that moment she made a decision. If this was to be her humiliation, she would face it on her own terms. Her grandfather's words echoed in her mind. "This violin is your bridge, Abigail. It will take you where you need to go." And then she began to play. In the first notes were hesitant, almost fragile as they floated through the air, but as the melody took shape, something shifted. Abigail's fingers found their confidence, her bow moving with increasing fluidity across the strings. She played the piece her grandfather had taught her, the one that had passed down through her family for generations. As the music filled the room, the smirks and whispers faded away. The guests stood transfixed, their champagne flutes forgotten in their hands. Even the servers paused in their duties, drawn in by the haunting beauty of the melody. But it was Garrett's reaction that was truly transformative. As the familiar notes washed over him, the smug smile slipped from his face, replaced by an expression of shock and then recognition. His eyes widened, his breath catching in his throat as memories long buried began to surface. This wasn't just any melody. It was his mother's composition, a piece she had written but never shared with the world. A piece that, as far as Garrett knew, had died with her on that rainy afternoon so many years ago. As Abigail played, lost in the music and unaware of the impact she was having, Garrett felt something crack within him. The carefully constructed walls he had built around his heart began to crumble, and for the first time in years he felt the stirring of an emotion he had long thought dead. When the final note faded away, the room remained silent for a heartbeat before erupting into genuine, enthusiastic applause. Abigail opened her eyes, stunned by the response. But her gaze quickly found Garrett, and what she saw there made her breath catch. Gone was the arrogant businessman who had sought to humiliate her. In his place stood a man shaken to his core, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. In that moment, though neither of them fully understood it yet, everything had changed. The inciting incident had occurred, setting in motion a chain of events that would unravel secrets, challenge perceptions, and ultimately bridge the vast divide between their two worlds. The melody that Abigail had played was more than just a beautiful piece of music. It was the key to unlocking a shared past, a connection neither of them could have anticipated. As the applause continued to wash over her, Abigail couldn't help but feel that she had just taken the first step on a journey that would change her life forever. Little did she know it would change Garrett's too. If you've enjoyed this story so far, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more captivating tales that blend music, mystery, and the complexities of human relationships. Your support helps us continue crafting these immersive narratives. Stay tuned for the next chapter in Abigail and Garrett's unexpected journey. The days following Abigail's impromptu performance at the Whitman estate were a whirlwind of emotions and unexpected developments. The applause had barely faded when Leonard Chaston, the renowned conductor of the New York Philharmonic, approached her with an offer that seemed too good to be true. "My dear," he said, his eyes twinkling with excitement, "I've heard many talented musicians in my time, but rarely have I encountered someone with your raw emotion and depth. I'd like to invite you to audition for a spot in my orchestra." Abigail stood there, stunned, her mind struggling to process the words. An audition for the New York Philharmonic. It was the stuff of dreams, so far removed from her daily reality of waiting tables and practicing in a cramped apartment that it hardly seemed possible. I don't know what to say," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Leonard smiled kindly. "You don't need to say anything right now. Take some time to think about it. But know this, Abigail, you have a gift. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." As Leonard moved away to mingle with the other guests, Abigail felt a presence behind her. She turned to find Garrett Whitman standing there, his expression unreadable. "It seems I underestimated you," he said, his voice low and measured. There was something in his eyes, a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. "That melody, where did you learn it?" Abigail, still reeling from Leonard's offer, found herself thrown off balance by Garrett's sudden interest. "My grandfather taught it to me," she replied cautiously. "It's been in our family for generations." A flicker of something, pain, recognition, crossed Garrett's face. "I see," he said, more to himself than to her. Then, seemingly coming to a decision, he added, "I'd like to help you, Abigail. With your audition, your training, whatever you need." Abigail blinked, certain she had misheard. "Help me? Why?" Garrett's gaze intensified. "Let's just say I have my reasons. Do you accept?" In that moment, standing amidst the glittering opulence of a world she didn't belong to, Abigail made a choice that would alter the course of her life. "Yes," she said, her voice stronger now. "I accept." The weeks that followed were a blur of intense preparation and emotional upheaval. Abigail's life, once divided neatly between her work at the restaurant and her solitary practice sessions, was now consumed by a rigorous training regimen. Garrett, true to his word, spared no expense. He arranged for top-tier instructors to work with Abigail, provided her with a practice space that made her tiny apartment seem like a closet in comparison, and even insisted on buying her a new violin, an instrument of such quality that Abigail was almost afraid to touch it at first. But with these new opportunities came new challenges. The instructors Garrett hired were world-class musicians themselves, and they pushed Abigail to her limits and beyond. There were days when her fingers bled from hours of practice, nights when she lay awake, the notes dancing behind her closed eyelids, taunting her with their complexity. Again, her violin instructor would say, his face impassive as Abigail struggled through a particularly difficult passage, "Your technique is improving, but you're losing the emotion. Remember why you're playing, Abigail. Feel the music." And she tried. Oh, how she tried. But, as the days wore on and the audition loomed closer, Abigail found herself plagued by doubt. Who was she to think she could compete with musicians who had been training their entire lives? What if Leonard Chaston had made a mistake? What if she was setting herself up for a fall that would be all the more painful for how high she had dared to dream? These doubts were compounded by the strain her new schedule was putting on her relationships. Her parents, while supportive, couldn't hide their concern about the amount of time she was spending with Garrett Whitman and his instructors. "We're proud of you, sweetheart," her mother said one evening, her eyes tired from another long day at the sewing machine. "But are you sure about all this? It's not like Garrett Whitman to be so generous. What does he want from you?" Abigail wished she had an answer. Despite the time they were spending together, Garrett remained an enigma. There were moments when she caught him watching her play, a look of such raw emotion on his face that it took her breath away. But just as quickly, the mask would slip back into place, and he would be all business again, discussing schedules and techniques with her instructors. As if her personal life wasn't complicated enough, Abigail soon discovered that the world of classical music was far more cutthroat than she had ever imagined. Word of Leonard Chaston's interest in her had spread, and suddenly she found herself the subject of intense scrutiny and, in some cases, outright hostility. It was at one of her first public rehearsals that Abigail encountered Sofia Valdez, a violinist whose talent was matched only by her ambition. Sofia approached Abigail during a break, her smile as sharp as a knife's edge. "So you're the waitress turned virtuoso," Sofia said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "How quaint. Tell me, does Garrett Whitman always take such an interest in the help, or are you a special case?" Abigail felt her cheeks burn. "Mr. Whitman is just helping me prepare for my audition," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Sofia laughed, a sound devoid of any real mirth. "Oh, honey, men like Garrett Whitman don't just help girls like you without expecting something in return. But don't worry, I'm sure your talents will be enough to secure you a spot in the orchestra. After all, diversity is so important these days." Before Abigail could respond, Sofia had sauntered away, leaving her feeling small and out of place in the grand rehearsal hall. It was a feeling that would become all too familiar in the weeks to come, as Abigail navigated a world where every smile hid a potential threat and every compliment came with strings attached. But even as she struggled with the politics and pressures of her new world, Abigail found herself drawn deeper into the mystery surrounding Garrett Whitman and the melody that had started it all. There were times, late at night when the rest of the world was asleep, that she would catch Garrett sitting alone in the practice room, staring at the piano with a look of such longing that it made her heart ache. One such night, unable to sleep and drawn by the sound of soft music, Abigail found Garrett at the piano, his fingers moving hesitantly over the keys. He was playing her grandfather's melody, but there was something different about it. Extra notes, subtle variations that made it sound both familiar and entirely new. "I didn't know you played," Abigail said softly, causing Garrett to startle and abruptly stop playing. He turned to look at her, and for a moment his guard was down. In his eyes, Abigail saw a well of pain so deep it took her breath away. "I don't," Garrett replied, his voice rough. "Not anymore. This was my mother's piece. She used to play it for me when I was a child." Abigail felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. "Your mother's? But how?" Garrett stood abruptly, the mask of the businessman sliding back into place. "It's late, Abigail. You should be resting. Your audition is in less than a week." As he brushed past her, Abigail caught his arm. "Garrett, wait. Please, what aren't you telling me?" For a moment it seemed as though he might pull away, retreat behind the walls he had so carefully constructed, but then his shoulders sagged and he turned back to face her. "It's a long story, Abigail. One I'm not sure I'm ready to tell. But I promise you this, after your audition, you'll know everything. For now, just focus on your music. It's more important than you know." With that cryptic statement, Garrett left, leaving Abigail alone in the practice room, her mind whirling with questions. As she picked up her violin and began to play, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the precipice of something much bigger than just an audition. The melody flowed from her fingers, familiar yet changed by what she had just learned. In its notes, Abigail heard echoes of Garrett's pain, of her own hopes and fears, of a connection that spanned generations. And as she played, a determination grew within her. Whatever secrets lay hidden in the past, whatever challenges awaited her in the future, Abigail knew one thing for certain: she would face them head-on, with her music as her guide and her strength. The day of the audition dawned bright and clear, the Savannah sun casting a golden glow over the city. Abigail stood outside the concert hall, her new violin case clutched tightly in her hands, her heart pounding a rhythm that threatened to drown out all other sound. She felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to see Garrett standing there, his face a mask of calm confidence that did little to hide the tension in his eyes. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice low and intense. Abigail took a deep breath, thinking of all the hours of practice, all the sacrifices, all the mysteries that still lay unsolved. "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied. Garrett nodded, squeezing her shoulder gently. "Remember, Abigail, this isn't just about getting a spot in the orchestra. This is about who you are, who you're meant to be. When you play, don't think about the judges or the competition. Think about the music, about why it matters to you." With those words ringing in her ears, Abigail stepped into the concert hall. The stage loomed before her, impossibly large and bright. In the seat sat Leonard Chastain and his panel of judges, their faces impassive as they watched her approach. As Abigail raised her violin to her shoulder, she caught sight of Sofia Valdez in the wings, her eyes gleaming with a mixture of contempt and fear. For a moment, doubt threatened to overwhelm her. What was she doing here, competing against people who had been training their entire lives? But then she closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and began to play. The first notes filled the air, hesitant at first, but growing in strength and confidence with each passing moment. Abigail poured everything she had into the music, her hopes, her fears, the mystery of her connection to Garrett, the love of her family, the dream she had nurtured for so long. As she played, the world around her faded away. There was no concert hall, no judges, no competition. There was only the music, flowing through her like a river, carrying her to places she had never imagined. When the final note faded away, Abigail opened her eyes to find the concert hall in stunned silence. For a heart-stopping moment, she feared she had failed, that her best hadn't been good enough. But then Leonard Chastain stood, a smile breaking across his face like the dawn. "My dear," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "I think we found our new first-chair violinist." The hall erupted in applause, but Abigail barely heard it. Her eyes sought out Garrett, standing at the back of the room. The look on his face, a mixture of pride, pain, and something deeper that she couldn't quite name, told her that this was only the beginning. As she stood there, basking in the glow of her triumph, Abigail knew that the real challenges, the real revelations, were yet to come. But for now, in this moment, she allowed herself to feel the pure joy of a dream realized, a bridge crossed, a destiny embraced. The music had carried her this far. Now it was time to see where else it might lead. The days following Abigail's triumphant audition were a whirlwind of emotions and new experiences. As she began her journey as the first-chair violinist of the New York Philharmonic, she found herself spending more and more time with Garrett Whitmer. What had started as a mentorship born of mysterious circumstances was slowly evolving into something deeper, more complex. One evening, as they sat in Garrett's study, after a long day of rehearsals, Abigail finally gathered the courage to broach the subject that had been haunting her since that night at the Whitman estate. "Garrett," she began, her voice soft but determined, "I think it's time you told me the truth about the melody, about your mother, about everything." Garrett's shoulders tensed, his gaze fixed on the amber liquid in his glass. For a moment, Abigail thought he might brush her off again, retreat behind the walls he'd so carefully constructed. But then he sighed, a sound so weary and vulnerable that it made her heart ache. "You're right," he said, finally meeting her eyes. "You deserve to know. But I warn you, Abigail, this story, it's not a happy one." As Garrett began to speak, his voice low and measured, Abigail felt as though she was being drawn into a world she had only glimpsed in fragments, a world of privilege and pain, of music silenced and dreams deferred. Elizabeth Whitman, Garrett's mother, had been a prodigy in her own right. A gifted pianist with a promising career ahead of her, she had caught the eye of Jonathan Whitman at a charity gala. Their whirlwind romance had culminated in a lavish wedding that was the talk of Savannah society. But for Elizabeth, marriage into the Whitman family came at a steep price. "My father," Garrett said, his voice tight with old anger, believed that a woman's place was in the home, supporting her husband's ambitions. "He saw my mother's music as a distraction, a frivolous pursuit that took her attention away from where it should be, on him, on the family name." Bit by bit, Jonathan had chipped away at Elizabeth's passion. First, it was subtle discouragement, then outright prohibition. The grand piano that had once been the centerpiece of their home was relegated to a back room, then sold entirely. Elizabeth's fingers, once calloused from hours of practice, grew soft and unfamiliar with the keys she had once loved. "But she never stopped creating," Garrett continued, a hint of wonder in his voice. "Late at night, when the house was asleep, she would sit at my bedside and compose in her head, humming melodies so softly I could barely hear them. That's where the piece you played came from. It was her lullaby to me, a promise that one day the music would return." As Garrett spoke, Abigail felt tears welling in her eyes. She thought of her own parents, of their unwavering support for her dreams despite their limited means. The contrast with Garrett's upbringing was stark and heartbreaking. "What happened to her?" Abigail asked, though part of her dreaded the answer. Garrett's face darkened. "Officially, a car accident on a rainy afternoon. But the truth is far more painful." He went on to describe how Elizabeth, unable to bear the silence any longer, had made plans to leave Jonathan. She had reached out to an old friend from her conservatory days, a violinist named Thomas Taylor, who had agreed to help her restart her career. "Thomas," Garrett said, his voice catching on the name. "He was your grandfather, Abigail." The revelation hit Abigail like a physical blow. Her grandfather, the man who had taught her to play, who had passed down the melody that had changed her life, he had known Garrett's mother, had been part of her story. But how, she began, her mind reeling. "They never got the chance to leave," Garrett continued, his eyes distant with the pain of old memories. "My father found out about their plans. There was a confrontation, a struggle. My mother, she fell, or was pushed. The official report called it an accident, but I've always known the truth." The weight of this revelation settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Abigail's mind was spinning, trying to reconcile the grandfather she had known and loved with this new information. How much had he known? How much had he kept hidden all these years? "After my mother's death," Garrett said, his voice barely above a whisper now, "your grandfather disappeared from Savannah. I never knew what became of him. And my father, he made sure that every trace of my mother's music was erased, or so he thought." Garrett stood, moving to a hidden safe behind one of the bookshelves. From it he retrieved a worn leather journal. This was hers, he said, handling the book with reverence. Her compositions, her thoughts, everything she couldn't express out loud. "I found it years after her death, hidden in the attic. It's how I recognized the melody you played that night." As Abigail took the journal with trembling hands, she felt as though she was holding a piece of history, not just Garrett's history, but her own. The connection between them, once a mystery, was now laid bare, revealing a tapestry of love, loss, and the enduring power of music. "Abigail," Garrett said, his voice soft but intense, "I need you to understand. When I heard you play that night, it wasn't just a beautiful performance. It was like hearing my mother's voice again, like she had found a way to reach across time and space to remind me of who I was meant to be." In that moment, looking into Garrett's eyes, Abigail saw not the arrogant businessman who had once sought to humiliate her, but a lost boy who had buried his pain and his passion beneath layers of carefully constructed indifference. Without thinking, she reached out, taking his hand in hers. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice thick with emotion, "for trusting me with this, for helping me, for everything." Garrett's fingers tightened around hers, and in that touch, Abigail felt the promise of something new, something that transcended mentor and protege, something that spoke of shared pain and mutual understanding. As the night wore on, they pored over Elizabeth's journal together, discovering melodies and memories that had been lost to time. With each page turned, each note deciphered, Abigail felt as though she was not just uncovering Garrett's past, but pieces of her own identity that she had never known were missing. In the days that followed, their relationship deepened in ways neither had anticipated. Music became their common language, a way to express the emotions that were too complex for words alone. Abigail would play passages from Elizabeth's compositions, bringing them to life for the first time in decades, while Garrett would share stories of his mother, painting a picture of a woman who had never stopped dreaming, even when the world tried to silence her. But as Abigail and Garrett grew closer, the world around them seemed determined to pull them apart. The classical music scene, already rife with competition and politics, became a minefield of rumors and speculation about the nature of their relationship. Sofia Valdez, still smarting from losing the first chair position to Abigail, became their most vocal critic. It's clear how she got the position. Sofia would say loudly in the rehearsal room, her voice dripping with insinuation, "I suppose sleeping with the benefactor is one way to secure a spot in the orchestra." The whispers and sidelong glances followed Abigail everywhere. Even Leonard Chastain, who had been her staunchest supporter, began to look at her with a hint of doubt in his eyes. "You must understand how this looks, my dear," he said one day after rehearsal, his voice gentle but firm. "Your talent is undeniable, but appearances matter in our world. Perhaps it would be best if Mr. Whitman took a step back for a while." Abigail felt torn. On one hand, she knew that her position in the orchestra was earned through her own hard work and talent. On the other, she couldn't deny the significant role Garrett had played in getting her to this point. The thought of distancing herself from him, especially now that she knew the truth about their shared history, felt like a betrayal. Garrett, for his part, seemed oblivious to the rumors swirling around them, or if he was aware, he gave no indication that they bothered him. His focus remained singular, helping Abigail unlock the full potential of her talent, and in the process, bringing his mother's long-silenced music back to life. It was during this tumultuous time that Abigail received a letter that would once again upend her world. The envelope, yellowed with age and bearing a return address she didn't recognize, contained a letter from her grandfather written years ago but never sent. With shaking hands, Abigail read the words that would fill in the final pieces of the puzzle. "My dearest Abigail, if you're reading this, then the time has come for you to know the truth. The melody I taught you, the one you've carried with you all these years, was never truly mine. It belonged to a remarkable woman named Elizabeth Whitman, a woman I loved deeply but lost too soon. Elizabeth and I were more than friends, we were soulmates, bound by our love of music and our dreams of a life free from the constraints of society's expectations. But when she died, a part of me died with her. I couldn't bear to stay in Savannah, surrounded by memories and secrets too painful to confront. But I couldn't let her music die, so I took the melody she had written for her son, the lullaby that was meant to be a promise of a brighter future, and I passed it on to you. In you, Abigail, Elizabeth's legacy lives on. Your talent, your passion, they are a testament to the power of music to transcend time and tragedy. I've kept this secret for so long, protecting you from a past that I feared might only bring you pain. But you deserve to know the truth about where you come from, about the remarkable woman whose music flows through your veins. Forgive an old man for his secrets, my dear. Know that everything I've done out of love for you, for Elizabeth, for the music that binds us all. With all my love, your grandfather." As Abigail finished reading, tears streaming down her face, she felt Garrett's presence beside her. Without a word, she handed him the letter, watching as his eyes widened with each line he read. When he finished, Garrett looked at her with a mixture of awe and something deeper, something that made Abigail's heart race. "Do you know what this means?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Abigail nodded, the truth settling over her like a warm blanket. "We're family," she said softly, "not by blood, but by something stronger, by music." In that moment, as they stood there, united by a shared history that was both beautiful and painful, Abigail and Garrett felt the last barriers between them crumble. They were no longer mentor and protege, no longer separated by class or experience. They were two people bound by a legacy of love and music, a legacy that had survived against all odds. As the sun set over Savannah, casting long shadows across the room, Abigail picked up her violin. Without a word, she began to play the melody that had started it all, Elizabeth's lullaby. But this time it was different. This time, Garrett moved to the piano, his fingers finding the keys with a certainty that belied years of silence. Together they played Elizabeth's composition as it was meant to be heard, violin and piano intertwining, creating a tapestry of sound that spoke of loss and love, of secrets revealed and futures rewritten. As the final notes faded away, Abigail and Garrett looked at each other, both understanding that this was just the beginning. They had uncovered the truth of their past, but the future, a future filled with music, with understanding, and with a connection deeper than either had ever known, lay before them, full of promise and possibility. In the quiet of the room, with the echoes of their shared melody still hanging in the air, Abigail and Garrett began to imagine what that future might hold. It would not be easy. There were still obstacles to overcome, prejudices to face, and a world of classical music that might not be ready for the story they had to tell. But they had something powerful on their side, the truth of who they were, the strength of their connection, and the enduring legacy of a woman who had never stopped believing in the power of music to change lives. As night fell over Savannah, Abigail and Garrett sat side by side, poring over Elizabeth's journal, making plans to bring her long-lost compositions to life. They were no longer alone in their struggles or their dreams. They had found in each other not just a partner, but a kindred spirit, someone who understood the deepest parts of their souls. And as they worked, their fingers occasionally brushing as they turned the pages, both Abigail and Garrett felt a sense of coming home. So not to a place, but to a person, to the truth of who they were meant to be. As Abigail's star continued to rise in the classical music world, she found herself navigating increasingly treacherous waters. The glittering concert halls and prestigious venues she now frequented were a far cry from the humble beginnings of her musical journey, but they came with their own set of challenges and dark undercurrents. It began with subtle hints and veiled comments. A patron would approach her after a performance, complimenting her skills before casually mentioning a private concert they'd love her to play, for a hefty fee, of course, paid discreetly. At first, Abigail brushed these offers aside, focusing on her work with the orchestra and her growing musical partnership with Garrett. But as time went on, the pressure intensified. She began to notice how certain musicians seemed to advance more quickly than others, despite not necessarily being the most talented. Whispers of donations to the right foundations, of private lessons with influential maestros that were more about connections than music, began to reach her ears. One evening, after a particularly grueling rehearsal, Sofia Valdez cornered Abigail in the dressing room. The rivalry between them had not diminished, but there was something different in Sofia's demeanor, a mixture of resignation and bitter amusement. "You know, Abigail," Sofia said, her voice low and conspiratorial, "you're good. Really good. But talent isn't always enough in this world." Abigail raised an eyebrow, wary of where this conversation was heading. "What do you mean?" Sofia laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. "Oh, come on, don't tell me you haven't noticed. The way certain mediocre players always seem to land the best gigs. The mysterious scholarships that appear out of nowhere for the children of wealthy patrons." As Sofia spoke, Abigail felt a chill run down her spine. She had noticed these things, had pushed away the nagging doubts and suspicions. But hearing them laid out so bluntly made them impossible to ignore. "And it's all a game," Abigail Sophia continued. "A game where the rules are written by those with the deeper cats. And you think your talent alone got you that first chair position? Wake up! Garrett Whitman's influence played a bigger role than you'd like to admit." Abigail wanted to protest, to defend her hard work and the genuine connection she shared with Garrett. But a seed of doubt had been planted. How much of her success was due to her own merit, and how much was because of Garrett's name and money? As she left the concert hall that night, Abigail's mind was in turmoil. The world she had dreamed of for so long, the pure realm of music she had imagined, was revealing itself to be tarnished and compromised. Her unease only grew in the following weeks. She began to notice things she had previously overlooked. The way certain board members would pull Leonard Chastain aside for private conversations, the sudden changes in the concert lineup to feature pieces by composers with powerful connections, the subtle pressures applied to musicians to participate in voluntary events for influential patrons. The turning point came during a prestigious music festival in Europe. Abigail had been thrilled to be invited, seeing it as a chance to showcase her talents on an international stage. But from the moment she arrived, she felt a sense of unease. The festival was awash with luxury, lavish parties, expensive gifts showered on select musicians, and an atmosphere that seemed more about networking and deal-making than about the music itself. Abigail found herself increasingly isolated, unwilling to play the games that seemed required for advancement. One evening she overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. Two festival organizers were discussing the upcoming competition, speaking in hushed tones about how the winners had already been decided, based not on talent, but on which contestants had the right connections or had made the right contributions. Shaken, Abigail retreated to her hotel room, her mind racing. This was everything she had ever dreamed of: international recognition, a chance to play with the world's best musicians. But at what cost? Was this the price of success in the classical music world? As she sat there, grappling with her disillusionment, her phone buzzed with a message from her adoptive mother back in Savannah. "Savannah? Sweetheart, I hope you're doing well at the festival. Your father and I are so proud of you. The community center where you used to practice is struggling. They might have to close the music program. I know you're busy, but if you could spare any time to help when you're back, it would mean the world to those kids. Love you." The message hit Abigail like a punch to the gut. She thought of the tiny practice room where she had spent countless hours honing her craft, of the kids who, like her, dreamed of a future in music. How many talented young musicians would never get the chance she had because they lacked the means or the connections? In that moment, Abigail felt torn between two worlds. On one side was the glittering promise of international stardom, of playing in the world's most prestigious venues. On the other was the simple, pure love of music that had driven her from the beginning, the desire to create something beautiful and share it with others. She thought of her adoptive parents who had sacrificed so much to support her dreams. They had never asked for anything in return, had never tried to exploit her growing fame or success. Their love and support had been unconditional, a stark contrast to the transactional relationships she was encountering in the professional music world. As dawn broke over the city, Abigail came to a decision. She couldn't continue to ignore the corruption she was seeing, couldn't compromise her integrity for the sake of advancement, but neither could she simply walk away from the platform she had worked so hard to achieve. With trembling fingers, she dialed Garrett's number. When he answered, his voice groggy with sleep, she didn't hesitate. "Garrett," she said, her voice firm despite the turmoil in her heart, "we need to talk about the music world, about what's really going on behind the scenes, and about what we're going to do to change it." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment Abigail feared she had misjudged him, that he was too entrenched in this world to see its flaws. But then Garrett spoke, his voice filled with a determination that matched her own. "I've been waiting for you to see it," he said softly. "To really see it. Tell me everything, Abigail. Together we'll find a way to make things right. As the sun rose over the city, casting a golden glow over the ancient streets, Abigail felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would not be easy, but she was no longer alone in her fight. With Garrett by her side and the memory of her grandfather's integrity guiding her, she was ready to take on the corruption that threatened to taint the music she loved. Shay! She thought of the melody that had brought her and Garrett together, the lullaby that had been a promise of a better future. Now, it was up to them to fulfill the promise, to create a world where music could flourish free from the taint of corruption and greed. As she packed her bags, preparing to leave the festival behind, Abigail felt a sense of lightness she hadn't experienced in months. She was turning her back on the easy path to success, but she was walking towards something far more valuable. A chance to make a real difference, to honor the legacy of those who had come before her, and to pave the way for future generations of musicians. With her violin case in hand and determination in her heart, Abigail stepped out into the morning light, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The music that had always been her solace and her strength now became her battle cry, a call to arms in the fight for the soul of the art she loved. The grand hall of the New York Philharmonic buzzed with anticipation. Tonight's performance was not just any concert, it was the unveiling of a long-lost composition, a piece that had been silenced for decades. As the audience settled into their seats, whispers of excitement and curiosity filled the air. Backstage, Abigail stood motionless, her violin clutched tightly to her chest. This was more than just another performance. It was the culmination of months of hard work, sleepless nights, and a journey that had taken her from the humble streets of Savannah to the pinnacle of the classical music world. Garrett appeared at her side, his presence a steady comfort in the storm of her emotions. "Are you ready?" he asked softly, his eyes searching hers. Abigail took a deep breath, thinking of all they had been through to reach this moment. The corruption they had uncovered, the battles they had fought, the truths they had revealed, it all led to this night. "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied, a small smile playing at her lips. Garrett squeezed her shoulder gently. "Remember, Abigail, this isn't just about the music. This is about setting things right, about honoring the legacy of those who came before us." She nodded, thinking of Elizabeth Whitman, of her grandfather, of all the musicians whose voices had been silenced by a system that valued connections over talent. Tonight she would play for them all. As they made their way to the stage, Abigail caught sight of Sofia Valdez in the wings. The rivalry between them had evolved into an uneasy alliance in recent months, as they had worked together to expose the corruption within the industry. Sofia gave her a curt nod, a gesture that spoke volumes about how far they had come. The spotlight hit Abigail as she took her place at center stage. The audience fell silent, all eyes fixed on the young violinist who had taken the classical world by storm. In the front row, she could see Leonard Chastain, his face a mixture of pride and apprehension. He had taken a significant risk in backing this performance, potentially jeopardizing his own career in the process. Abigail raised her bow, and in that moment of perfect stillness before the first note, she felt the weight of history on her shoulders. This was more than just a concert, it was a statement, a challenge to the status quo that had for too long dictated who could succeed in this world. The first notes of Elizabeth Whitman's long-lost symphony filled the hall, haunting and beautiful. As Abigail played, she poured everything into the music, her own journey, the pain and triumph of Elizabeth's story, the hope for a future where talent and passion would be the only currency that mattered. The piece was unlike anything the audience had heard before. It spoke of dreams deferred, of silence broken, of a voice that refused to be quieted. As the music swelled, Abigail could feel the energy in the room shifting, the audience leaning forward in their seats, captivated by the story being told through melody and harmony. From the corner of her eye, she saw Garrett at the piano, his fingers dancing across the keys with a grace that belied his years away from music. They had practiced this piece countless times, but tonight it felt different. Tonight it felt like coming home. As they reached the final movement, Abigail's bow flew across the strings with an intensity that took her breath away. The music built to a crescendo, layers of sound intertwining in a tapestry of emotion and memory. And then, just as it seemed the music could not possibly contain any more feeling, it softened, returning to the simple, haunting melody that had started it all, the lullaby that had connected Abigail and Garrett across time and tragedy. The final note hung in the air, resonating through the hall long after Abigail had lowered her bow. For a moment, there was complete silence, as if the audience was collectively holding its breath. Then, like a dam breaking, the applause erupted. It started slowly, a ripple of clapping that quickly grew into a thunderous standing ovation. Abigail stood there, overwhelmed by the response, tears streaming down her face as she took in the sight before her. In the front row, Leonard Chaston was on his feet, applauding with a vigor that seemed to defy his age. Beside him, several of the board members who had initially opposed this performance were wiping tears from their eyes, moved despite themselves by the power of the music. As Abigail took her bows, her gaze swept the audience, landing on a group of young musicians seated in the balcony. They were students from the community center back in Savannah, flown in specially for this performance. Their faces shone with awe and inspiration, and in that moment, Abigail knew that every struggle, every setback had been worth it. But the night was far from over. As the applause finally died down and the audience began to file out of the hall, murmuring excitedly about what they had just witnessed, Abigail and Garrett made their way backstage. They had agreed that tonight, after the performance, they would finally reveal the full truth about Elizabeth Whitman's story and the corruption they had uncovered. A small army of reporters waited for them, cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward eagerly. Abigail took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. Garrett stood beside her, a steady presence radiating support. "Thank you all for coming," Abigail began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Tonight's performance was more than just a concert. It was the culmination of a journey that began generations ago, with a talented musician named Elizabeth Whitman. As Abigail spoke, weaving together the threads of Elizabeth's story, her own path, and the dark underbelly of the classical music world they had uncovered, she could see the shock and disbelief on the faces of the reporters. She detailed the pressure to conform, the pay-for-play schemes, the silencing of voices that didn't fit the established narrative. "We stand here tonight," she concluded, her voice ringing with conviction, not just as musicians, but as advocates for change. The world of classical music has for too long been governed by factors other than talent and passion. Tonight, we call for a return to the purity of the art, to a system where every voice has the chance to be heard. The press conference that followed was a whirlwind of questions, accusations, and revelations. Garrett spoke of his mother's struggles, of the systemic issues that had plagued the industry for decades. Together, they laid bare the ugly truth behind the beautiful facade, challenging the establishment to do better, to be better. As the night wore on, Abigail could feel the tide of public opinion shifting. Social media was ablaze with discussions of the concert and the subsequent revelations. Messages of support poured in from musicians around the world, many sharing their own stories of struggle against a system that seemed designed to keep them out. But with the support came backlash. Several prominent figures in the classical music world denounced Abigail and Garrett, accusing them of sensationalism and ingratitude. Threats of legal action and blacklisting began to circulate. In the eye of this storm, Abigail and Garrett found a moment of quiet. They stood on the roof of the concert hall, looking out over the glittering New York skyline. "Do you think we did the right thing?" Abigail asked softly, the weight of the night's events settling on her shoulders. Garrett was silent for a moment, his gaze distant. Then he turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and pride. "I think we did the only thing we could do," he replied. "My mother's music was silenced once. We couldn't let that happen again, to her or to anyone else." Abigail nodded, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. Despite the uncertainty of what lay ahead, they had taken a stand, had used their platform to shine a light on the darkness that had for too long gone unchallenged. As they stood there, the first light of dawn breaking over the city, Abigail felt a shift in the air. Something had changed tonight, not just for her and Garrett, but for the entire world of classical music. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges and opposition from those who benefited from the old system. But as she thought of the young musicians in the audience, of the messages of support pouring in from around the world, Abigail knew that they had sparked something powerful, a movement for change, a call for a return to the true spirit of music. The melody of Elizabeth's lullaby played in her mind, a reminder of why they had embarked on this journey in the first place. It was a promise of a better future, a world where music could flourish free from corruption and politics. As the sun rose over New York, casting a golden glow over the city, Abigail and Garrett stood side by side, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. They had found in each other not just allies, but kindred spirits united by a shared past and a common vision for the future. The climax of their personal journey had become the opening movement of a greater symphony, one that would resonate through the halls of power, challenge long-held assumptions, and ultimately, they hoped, lead to a renaissance in the world of classical music. Abigail picked up her violin, which had been resting against the wall. Without a word, she began to play, the notes of Elizabeth's lullaby floating out over the awakening city. Garrett closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him, a smile playing at his lips. In this moment, surrounded by the promise of a new day and the echoes of a long-silenced voice, they both knew that their fight was far from over, that they were ready for it, armed with the truth, their talent, and the power of a melody that had survived against all odds. As Abigail's music soared above the city, carrying with it the hopes and dreams of generations, she felt a sense of purpose unlike anything she had ever known. This was why she played, why she had fought so hard to be heard, not for fame or accolades, but for moments like this, when music could touch hearts, change minds, and maybe, just maybe, change the world. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The symphony of change had begun, and its echoes would be felt for years to come. And if you've been moved by Abigail and Garrett's journey and want to hear more stories that explore the transformative power of music and the courage to stand up for what's right, leave a comment with the number 1. Your engagement helps us continue to craft these meaningful narratives, and we'd love to know what resonated with you in this tale of talent, truth, and triumph against the odds. The weeks following the groundbreaking performance and revelations were a whirlwind of activity. Abigail and Garrett found themselves at the center of a storm that was shaking the foundations of the classical music world. Their phones rang incessantly with interview requests, messages of support, and, increasingly, threats from those who saw their actions as a betrayal of the established order. At first, the momentum seemed to be on their side. Musicians from around the globe came forward with their own stories of corruption and unfair practices. A movement was building, calling for transparency and reform in orchestras, conservatories, and music competitions worldwide. Abigail and Garrett became the faces of this revolution, their names synonymous with the fight for integrity in classical music. But as the days wore on, the backlash intensified. Powerful figures in the industry, those with the most to lose from the exposure of the corrupt system, began to fight back. Suddenly, Abigail found her past scrutinized, every decision she had ever made picked apart and analyzed for signs of hypocrisy or ulterior motives. One morning, as Abigail was preparing for a crucial interview with a major news network, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. The contents made her blood run cold. Back off now, or everyone will know the truth about how you really got your position. Your precious Garrett isn't as clean as you think. Ask him about the Savannah Symphony Fund. Abigail's hand shook as she read the message. She had always known that taking on the establishment would have consequences, but this felt personal, a direct attack on the foundation of trust she had built with Garrett. When she confronted him about it, Garrett's face paled. "Abigail, I can explain," he began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "The Savannah Symphony Fund, It was something my father set up years ago. I didn't know at the time, but it was used to influence decisions, to ensure certain players got positions they might not have earned on merit alone. The revelation hit Abigail like a physical blow. "And my position?" she asked, hardly daring to breathe. "Did you use that fund to secure my place in the orchestra?" Garrett's silence was answer enough. Abigail felt the room spin around her, memories of her audition, her triumph, now tainted by this new knowledge. Had her talent meant nothing? Was she just another pawn in the very system she was fighting against? "I never meant to deceive you," Garrett said, reaching out to her. But Abigail stepped back, shaking her head. "How can I trust anything now?" she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. "How can I stand in front of the world and call for change when my own position was bought and paid for?" The rift that opened between them that day seemed insurmountable. Abigail threw herself into her practice, spending hours locked away with her violin, trying to prove to herself that she deserved her place, that her talent was real. But every note seemed to mock her, a reminder of the taint that now clung to her success. Garrett, for his part, tried desperately to make amends. He offered to resign from his positions, to publicly confess his part in the corrupt system, but the damage was done. The trust between them, once so strong, now lay in shattered pieces at their feet. As news of the discord between them leaked to the press, the movement they had started began to falter. Critics pointed to their falling out as proof that their calls for reform were nothing but a publicity stunt, a way to gain fame and influence for themselves. Abigail found herself isolated, caught between her desire for justice and the crushing weight of disillusionment. The very people she had sought to help now looked at her with suspicion, wondering if she was just another fraud in a world full of them. The final blow came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Abigail was leaving a rehearsal, her mind still swirling with doubts and recriminations, when she saw the crowd gathered outside the concert hall. At first, she thought it was just another group of reporters, but as she drew closer, she realized it was a protest. Musicians, students, and music lovers held signs denouncing her as a hypocrite and a fraud. "No more fake reformers," one sign read. "Music for talent, not connections," proclaimed another. The very slogans she had once championed were now being used against her. As Abigail tried to push through the crowd, someone recognized her. A chorus of boos and jeers erupted. She felt hands pushing at her, heard angry voices demanding explanations. In the chaos, her violin case was knocked from her grasp, clattering to the wet pavement. Time seemed to slow as Abigail watched her beloved instrument, the violin that had been her constant companion through every trial and triumph, fall from its case. The crack of wood splitting was audible, even over the roar of the crowd. Abigail fell to her knees, cradling the broken pieces of her violin, oblivious to the rain soaking through her clothes or the continuing shouts of the protesters. In that moment, surrounded by anger and disillusionment, her most precious possession lying broken in her arms, Abigail felt something break inside her as well. The passion that had driven her, the fire that had sustained her through every challenge, flickered and died. As the days passed, Abigail retreated further into herself. She stopped answering calls, cancelled performances, and eventually took an indefinite leave of absence from the orchestra. The world of music, once her sanctuary, now felt like a battlefield where every note was a painful reminder of her shattered dreams. Garrett, watching helplessly as Abigail spiraled into despair, faced his own crisis. The empire he had inherited, built on connections and influence rather than true merit, began to crumble as investors pulled out and partners distanced themselves from the scandal. The Whitman name, once synonymous with power and prestige, was now tarnished beyond repair. One evening, as Garrett sat alone in his study, surrounded by the trappings of a life that no longer held any meaning for him, he came across an old photograph. It showed his mother, Elizabeth, sitting at her piano, a young Garrett on her lap. The joy on their faces, the pure love of music that radiated from the image, brought tears to his eyes. What had they become? In their quest to right the wrongs of the past, had they lost sight of what truly mattered? The music, the passion, the simple joy of creating something beautiful, it had all been buried under layers of politics, ambition, and now shame. Miles away in a small apartment, Abigail sat in the dark, the broken pieces of a violin laid out before her like a jigsaw puzzle she couldn't solve. Her fingers, once so sure and strong, now felt clumsy and weak. She hadn't played a note in weeks, the very thought of music bringing a wave of nausea and self-loathing. As she sat there, lost in her misery, a faint melody drifted through her open window. It was a street musician, playing a simple tune on an old guitar. The notes were imperfect, the rhythm slightly off, but there was a rawness to it, an honesty that cut through Abigail's despair. For the first time in weeks, she felt something stir within her. It wasn't the grand passion that had once driven her to greatness, but a tiny spark, a reminder of why she had fallen in love with music in the first place. It wasn't about perfection or acclaim. It was about connection, about touching hearts and souls with the universal language of melody. With trembling hands, Abigail reached for the broken pieces of a violin. She couldn't play it, not in its current state, but as she ran her fingers over the familiar wood, she felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps, like her beloved instrument, she too could be repaired. It wouldn't be easy and she might never be the same, but maybe, just maybe, there was still music left in her. As dawn broke over the city, casting a pale light over two souls lost in their own private torments, both Abigail and Garrett found themselves at a crossroads. The path they had been on, paved with good intentions but marred by compromise and deceit, had led them to this point of crisis. But in the depths of their despair, a faint melody could be heard, the echo of a lullaby written long ago, a promise of redemption and renewal. The journey ahead would be difficult, the road to recovery long and fraught with challenges. But as the first rays of sunlight pierced the darkness, both Abigail and Garrett felt a stirring of something they had thought lost forever: hope. The tragedy that had befallen them was not the end of their story, but perhaps the beginning of a new movement, one built not on exposing the faults of others, but on rediscovering the pure, transformative power of music itself. As Abigail sat in her dimly lit apartment, surrounded by the remnants of her shattered dreams and broken violin, a soft knock on the door startled her from her reverie. She hesitated, having shut out the world for weeks now, but something about the gentle persistence of the knocking compelled her to answer. When she opened the door, she found herself face to face with an elderly man she had never seen before. His weathered face was kind, his eyes twinkling with a mixture of wisdom and mischief. "Abigail Taylor," he asked, his voice warm and slightly accented. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but I believe we have much to discuss." Confused and wary, Abigail nonetheless felt drawn to this mysterious visitor. She invited him in, watching as he surveyed her sparse living room with interest, his gaze lingering on the broken violin on the coffee table. "My name is Victor Petrov," he said, settling into a chair, "and I knew your grandfather, Thomas Taylor." Adele's breath caught in her throat. Her grandfather had been gone for years, and she had thought all connections to her past had been severed. How did you know him?" she managed to ask. "Well," Victor smiled, a hint of sadness in his eyes. "We were colleagues many years ago at the Moscow Conservatory. Your grandfather was there on an exchange program when he met Elizabeth Whitman." The mention of Elizabeth's name sent a jolt through Abigail. She leaned forward, suddenly eager to hear more. "What you and Garrett have uncovered," Victor continued, "is only part of the story. The corruption in the classical music world goes deeper than you could imagine, and it has roots that stretch back decades." Over the next hour, Victor unfolded a tale that left Abigail reeling. He spoke of a secret society within the highest echelons of the classical music world, a group that had for generations controlled not just who succeeded, but what music was allowed to be heard. Elizabeth Whitman was a threat to them, Victor explained. Her compositions challenged the established order. They couldn't control her, couldn't make her conform, so they silenced her. Abigail felt a chill run down her spine. "Are you saying her death wasn't an accident?" Victor's eyes met hers, filled with a mixture of sorrow and determination. Your grandfather suspected as much. He spent years gathering evidence, trying to expose the truth, but they were too powerful. He had to go into hiding to protect himself and to protect you. The revelation hit Abigail like a physical blow. All this time she had thought her grandfather had simply abandoned his music, when in reality he had been fighting a silent battle against forces she couldn't have imagined. "But why are you telling me this now?" Abigail asked, her mind whirling with the implications of what she had learned. Victor reached into his coat and pulled out a USB drive. "Because your grandfather left something behind. A final composition, encoded with all the evidence he gathered. He entrusted it to me to keep safe until the right moment. And now, Abigail, that moment has come." As Victor placed the drive in her trembling hands, Abigail felt a surge of emotion, grief for the grandfather she had never truly known, anger at the forces that had shaped her life from the shadows, and a flicker of the passion that had once driven her. "What am I supposed to do with this?" she whispered, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. "Nah." Victor's eyes gleamed with a fierce light. "You're going to finish what your grandfather started. You're going to play this piece, Abigail, and in doing so, you're going to expose the truth to the world." The idea seemed impossible. Abigail glanced at her broken violin, a physical representation of her shattered confidence. "I can't," she said, shaking her head. I'm not the musician I thought I was. It was all a lie." Victor leaned forward, his gaze intense. "No, Abigail, your talent is real. The corruption in the system doesn't negate your hard work or your passion. You have a gift, one that goes beyond any influence Garrett or anyone else might have had. This is your chance to use that gift for something greater than yourself." As Victor's words sank in, Abigail felt something shift within her. The spark of hope that had been kindled by the street musician's song now flared into a flame. She thought of her grandfather, of Elizabeth Whitman, of all the musicians who had been silenced or manipulated by this shadowy cabal. "All right," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I'll do it, but I can't do it alone." Victor smiled, a look of relief and pride crossing his face. "You won't have to. There are others who have been waiting for this moment, musicians and industry insiders who want to see change. And," he added, his eyes twinkling, "I think there's someone else who needs to be part of this." Abigail knew immediately who he meant. Despite everything that had happened, despite the pain and betrayal, she knew that Garrett needed to be involved. This was his mother's legacy too. As if on cue, there was another knock at the door. When Abigail opened it, she found Garrett standing there, looking as lost and broken as she felt. Their eyes met, and in that moment, 1,000 unspoken words passed between them. "I'm sorry," Garrett began, but Abigail cut him off. "We don't have time for that now," she said, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. "We have work to do." "Ew." As Garrett entered the apartment, his eyes widening at the sight of Victor, Abigail felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced in months. The path ahead was unclear and undoubtedly dangerous, but for the first time in a long time she felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. Victor looked between the two of them, a knowing smile on his face. "Now," he said, rubbing his hands together, "let's see about fixing that violin, shall we? We have a concert to prepare for." Over the next few weeks, Abigail, Garrett, and Victor worked tirelessly. The composition left behind by Thomas Taylor was complex, unlike anything Abigail had ever played before. But it required not just technical skill, but an emotional depth that pushed her to her limits. As they worked, other allies emerged from the shadows. A luthier who had once been blacklisted for speaking out against corruption offered to repair Abigail's violin, infusing it with a warmth and richness of tone she had never thought possible. Musicians who had been silenced or pushed out of the industry came forward, offering their support and their talents. But Garrett, for his part, threw himself into the effort with a fervor that surprised even him. He used his connections, not to gain advantage, but to secure a venue for the performance and to ensure that key industry figures and media would be present. As the day of the concert approached, tension mounted. Anonymous threats began to arrive, warning them to call off the performance. But rather than cowing them, these threats only strengthened their resolve. The night before the concert, Abigail and Garrett found themselves alone in the practice room. The air between them was charged with unspoken emotions and the weight of their shared purpose. "Abigail," Garrett said softly, "I know I can never fully make up for my part in all this, but I want you to know, whatever happens tomorrow, I'm proud to stand beside you." Abigail looked at him, seeing not the polished businessman or the conflicted son, but simply a fellow musician, someone who understood the power of music to change lives. She reached out, taking his hand in hers. "You're going to finish this," she said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "For your mother, for my grandfather, for all the musicians who never got the chance to be heard." And we're going to play their song. As they stood there, hands clasped, the melody of Elizabeth's lullaby seemed to float around them, a reminder of where they had started and how far they had come. Tomorrow they would face their greatest challenge yet. They would stand before the world and play a piece that could shake the foundations of the classical music establishment. They would risk everything in the name of truth and artistic integrity. But in this moment, in the quiet of the practice room, Abigail and Garrett found a piece they had thought lost forever. Whatever the future held, they would face it together, their music a beacon of hope in a world that desperately needed change. As the first light of dawn broke over the city, they picked up their instruments one last time, ready to rehearse the piece that would change everything. The surprising alliance of the disgraced prodigy, the reformed insider, and the keeper of long-buried secrets was about to take center stage, and the world of classical music would never be the same. The concert hall buzzed with an electric tension as the audience filed in. This was no ordinary performance, and everyone knew it. Rumors had been swirling for weeks about what Abigail Taylor and Garrett Whitman went in the presence of media outlets from around the world only added to the sense of anticipation. Backstage, Abigail stood motionless, her newly repaired violin cradled in her arms. She could hear the murmur of the crowd beyond the curtain, feel the weight of expectation pressing down on her. Garrett appeared at her side, his face a mixture of determination and barely concealed anxiety. "Are you ready?" he asked softly. Abigail took a deep breath, thinking of all they had been through to reach this moment. The corruption they had uncovered, the personal betrayals, the crushing self-doubt, and finally the surprising revelations that had brought them back together with a renewed sense of purpose. "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied, managing a small smile. Viktor Petrov approached them, his eyes twinkling with a mixture of pride and mischief. "Remember," he said, his voice low and urgent, "the truth is in the music. Let it speak through you." With those words ringing in their ears, Abigail and Garrett made their way to the stage. The spotlight hit them as they took their positions, and for a moment, the hall fell into an expectant hush. Abigail raised her bow, and in that breathless moment before the first note, she felt a connection to something greater than herself. She thought of her grandfather, of Elizabeth Whitman, of all the musicians whose voices had been silenced over the years. This performance was for them. The music that poured forth was unlike anything the audience had ever heard. It started softly, almost hesitantly, like a secret being whispered, but as it grew in complexity and volume, it seemed to take on a life of its own. Abigail's violin sang with a voice that was at once mournful and defiant, telling a story of loss, betrayal, and ultimately hope. Garrett's piano provided the perfect counterpoint, his fingers flying over the keys with a passion that surprised even him. Together, they wove a tapestry of sound that held the audience spellbound. As they played, something extraordinary began to happen. The music, encoded with the evidence Thomas Taylor had spent years gathering, began to trigger reactions throughout the hall. Specific phrases caused certain audience members to shift uncomfortably in their seats. This led to gasps of recognition or shock. In the balcony, a group of industry executives who had long benefited from the corrupt system exchanged worried glances. They could hear their crimes being laid bare in the haunting melody, could feel the weight of their actions pressing down on them with each crescendo. But it wasn't just an expose of wrongdoing. The composition also celebrated the true spirit of music, the raw talent and passion that had been suppressed for too long. It spoke of the beauty that could flourish when artists were free to express themselves without fear or constraint. As the piece reached its climax, Abigail felt as though she was channeling generations of silent musicians. Her bow moved across the strings with a ferocity that surprised even her, drawing forth notes that seemed to pierce the very soul. And then, just as it seemed the music could not possibly contain any more emotion, it softened, returning to the simple, haunting melody of Elizabeth's lullaby. As Abigail played those familiar notes, she opened her eyes for the first time since beginning the piece. What she saw took her breath away. The entire audience was on its feet, many with tears streaming down their faces. In the front row, she could see Leonard Kasten, his expression a mixture of awe and dawning understanding. Beside him, several of the most powerful figures in the classical music world stood rigid, their faces pale with the realization of what had just been revealed. As the final note faded away, there was a moment of absolute silence. It stretched on, second after second, as the audience collectively held its breath, trying to process what they had just experienced. And then, like a dam breaking, the applause erupted. It wasn't just clapping, it was a roar, a catharsis, a demand for change. The people were shouting, crying, embracing strangers next to them who had been equally moved by the performance. Abigail and Garrett stood there, overwhelmed by the response. They had known the piece would have an impact, but this was beyond anything they had imagined. As the applause continued to thunder through the hall, Victor made his way to the stage. He carried with him a folder, which he handed to a stunned-looking Leonard Kasten in the front row. "The full evidence is in there," Victor announced, his voice somehow carrying over the din. "Decades of corruption, manipulation, and silenced artists. It's time for a change." The next few hours passed in a blur. As the audience filed out, still buzzing with excitement and shock, journalists swarmed the stage, clamoring for interviews and statements. Industry executives huddled in corners, whispering urgently into phones. And through it all, Abigail and Garrett stood side by side, united in their triumph and in the knowledge that their fight was far from over. In the days that followed, the classical music world was turned upside down. The evidence provided by Thomas Taylor, brought to life through his granddaughter's performance, was irrefutable. Investigations were launched, resignations tendered, and long-buried truths finally came to light. But more importantly, a conversation had begun. Musicians from around the world, emboldened by Abigail and Garrett's stand, began to speak out about their own experiences. Conservatories and orchestras pledged to reform their practices, to prioritize talent and passion over connections and influence. For Abigail and Garrett, the aftermath of their performance brought both challenges and opportunities. They found themselves at the forefront of a movement for change, sought after for interviews, concerts, and speaking engagements. But amidst the whirlwind of activity, they also found moments of quiet reflection. One evening, as they sat in Garrett's study, surrounded by press clippings and messages of support, Abigail turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "What do we do now?" she asked softly. "We've exposed the truth, started this conversation. But how do we ensure real, lasting change?" Garrett was quiet for a moment, his fingers absently tracing the keys of the piano beside him. "I think," he said slowly, "we need to go back to basics. To remind everyone, including ourselves, why we fell in love with music in the first place." And so, even as they continued to advocate for reform and transparency in the industry, Abigail and Garrett embarked on a new project. They began hosting small, intimate concerts in community centers, schools, and retirement homes. That played not just classical pieces, but folk songs, jazz standards, even popular duos, breaking down the barriers between genres and reminding people of the universal power of music. They established a foundation in Elizabeth Whitman's name, dedicated to supporting young musicians from underprivileged backgrounds. The foundation provided instruments, lessons, and mentorship, ensuring that talent would not be stifled by lack of resources. As the months passed, Abigail and Garrett's relationship deepened and evolved. They shared trauma of their past, and the joint purpose of their present had forged a bond between them that went beyond romance or friendship. They were partners in the truest sense of the word, each supporting and challenging the other to grow both as musicians and as individuals. 1 year to the day after their groundbreaking performance, Abigail and Garrett found themselves back in Savannah, in the small community center where Abigail had first learned to play. They had organized a concert, not for industry bigwigs or the press, but for the local community that had supported Abigail from the beginning. As they prepared to take the stage, Abigail felt a sense of coming full circle. She thought of her younger self, practicing in this very room, dreaming of a future in music, but never imagining the journey that lay ahead. "You ready?" Garrett asked, a soft smile playing on his lips. Abigail nodded, returning his smile. "Always." And as they stepped out onto the small stage, greeted by the warm applause of friends, family, and community members, Abigail felt a profound sense of peace. The road ahead was still long, the fight for a more just and transparent music industry far from over. But in this moment, surrounded by the people who had believed in her from the start, she knew that they were on the right path. The first notes of their duet filled the room, a piece they had composed together, blending elements of classical, jazz, and folk music. It told the story of their journey, the highs and lows, the triumphs and setbacks, but more than that, it spoke of resilience, of the enduring power of music to heal, unite, and inspire. As they played, Abigail caught Garrett's eye, saw the same joy and passion reflected there that she felt in her own heart. They had been through so much, had faced challenges that had nearly broken them. But here they were, still playing, still fighting for what they believed in. The music swelled, filling every corner of the small room, touching every heart. And as Abigail's bow danced across the strings of her violin, she felt a profound sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the gift of music, for the strength to persevere, and for the unexpected journey that had brought her to this moment. As the final notes faded away, Abigail knew that this was not an ending, but a new beginning. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever obstacles they might face, she and Garrett would face them together, with music as their guide and their strength. The applause that followed was not as thunderous as that in the grand concert halls of New York or London, but to Abigail, it was the sweetest sound she had ever heard. It was the sound of home, of community, of a dream not just realized but transformed into something greater than she had ever imagined. As they took their bows, Abigail and Garrett's hands found each other, fingers intertwining in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. They had started this journey as reluctant allies, brought together by circumstance and a shared legacy. Now they stood united, not just in their mission to change the music world, but in a deep, abiding connection that went beyond words. The future stretched out before them, full of possibilities. There would be more battles to fight, more truths to uncover, more music to create. But for now, in this moment, surrounded by the warmth of community and the lingering echoes of their performance, Abigail and Garrett were exactly where they were meant to be. As they left the stage, hand in hand, ready to greet their audience and share in the joy of the evening, Abigail felt a familiar melody stirring in her heart. It was Elizabeth's lullaby, the song that had started it all. But now, it wasn't just a reminder of the past. It was a promise for the future, a gentle refrain that whispered of hope, of love, and of the enduring power of music to change lives and heal hearts. The symphony of their lives, with all its complex harmonies and unexpected key changes, was far from over. But with each other, and with their unwavering commitment to the truth and beauty of music, Abigail and Garrett were ready to face whatever the next movement might bring. Neo. And so, as the night drew to a close and a new chapter beckoned, the melody played on, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the transformative power of art. In the end, it was not about fame or accolades, but about staying true to the music in their hearts and using their gifts to make the world a little bit better, one note at a time. Dear listeners, Antai Amta Night. As we conclude this journey with Abigail and Garrett, we're reminded that me wape is more than just notes on a page or sounds in the air. It's the heartbeat of our shared human experience, a universal language that speaks to our deepest emotions and connects us across all barriers. The story teaches us that true passion can overcome any obstacle, that integrity shines brightest in the darkest of times, and that our greatest strengths often emerge from our deepest wounds. Or like Abigail's broken violin, we too can be repaired, our cracks filled with gold, making us even more beautiful and resilient than before. Remember, every one of us has a unique melody within. Whether you're on the grand stage of life or playing in the quiet corners of your community, your song matters. It has the power to inspire, to heal, and to change the world around you. Don't let fear silence your music. Don't let others dictate the rhythm of your life. Stand up for what you believe in, even when it seems the whole world is against you. Your truth, sung with conviction, can start a revolution. And when you feel lost or doubting yourself, recall the lullaby that guided Abigail and Garrett. Let it remind you that you're part of a greater symphony, connected to those who came before and those who will follow. So pick up your instrument, whatever it may be. Raise your voice, share your story. The world is waiting for your unique contribution to the great composition of life. Because in the end, it's not about fame or perfection. It's about playing your part with all your heart, creating harmony in a world that desperately needs it. Your melody matters. Your story is worth telling. Your music can change lives. So, what song will you play today? Thank you all for joining us on this emotional journey through the world of Abigail and Garrett. Isendevet, your support and engagement mean the world to us. We'd love to hear how this story has touched you. Did you find yourself relating to Abigail's struggles or Garrett's journey of redemption? Perhaps the power of music in their lives resonated with your own experiences. Please take a moment to share your thoughts, feelings, and any personal connections you've made with this story in the comments section below. Your insights not only enrich our community, but also inspire us to continue crafting meaningful narratives that speak to the heart. Remember, every comment, every shared experience is a note in the greater symphony of our storytelling. Your voice matters, and it fuels our passion to bring you more stories that challenge, inspire, and move you. So don't hesitate, let us know what you think. What moments touched you the most? What lessons will you take away from Abigail and Garrett's journey? Your feedback is the melody that keeps our creative spirits soaring. Thank you for being part of our storytelling community. Together we're composing something truly beautiful.